done, we can start. Welcome everyone to the first webinar in this year-long series on power and political lives convened by the Political World's Research Cluster here at Oxford. This cluster looks at questions of how power and politics are constituted in space and place. Some of the themes that our cluster looks at are life, death, and well-being, violence, non-violence, and disciplining, politics, power, and geopolitics, and geographical knowledges. This series will run every other Friday in this term and also at various times next term, which we'll announce later on. So this first talk is by Dr. Yousuf Al-Bulushi, who is assistant professor at UC Irvine in Global and International Studies, and it will be titled Anti-Blackness and Dual Power, Thinking from Durban, South Africa. Dr. Amber Murray, who co-convenes this cluster with me, will now introduce Dr. Bulushi and the talk.
Thank you, Sneha. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today for what is sure to be an important and provocative discussion on urban social movements in South Africa and beyond. My name is Amber Murray, and I'm an associate professor of human geography at the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. I am the co-coordinator, along with Sneha Krishnan, of the Political Worlds Cluster. I'm pleased and honored to introduce our speaker and later our discussant for today's webinar, which Sneha mentioned is the first in our Political Worlds series on power and political lives in geography. Dr. Yousuf Al-Bulushi is an assistant professor in the Department of Global and International Studies at the University of California, Irvine. He's a political geographer trained in urban studies, global political economy, social movements in Africa and the Americas, and political theory. He has a PhD in human geography from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His current research program includes a book examining the afterlife of apartheid geographies in the city of Durban, an intellectual history and geography of the city of Dar es Salaam, and a comparative study of post-2011 uprisings in Africa and the Americas. This is an ambitious and sure to be an important book project, and one which I'm particularly interested and anxiously awaiting. It promises to tie together critical scholarship on racial capitalism with an analysis of contemporary social movements in Libya, Egypt, South Africa, and elsewhere. His is an example of active scholarship within critical human geography on urgent and timely political issues. His work and teaching is particularly interested in the racializations of popular interpretations of Black struggle and movements for racial justice. With his colleagues Willie Wright and Adam Bledsoe, Dr. Al-Bulushi recently coordinated a two-day symposium in Baltimore, in Maryland, in the United States, titled Anti-Blackness in the American Metropolis. This was an event with seed funding from the Human Geography and Urban Geography journals. I tentatively anticipate that some of that work might be brought into and reflected in his talk for today, which is titled Anti-Blackness and Dual Power, Thinking from Durban, South Africa. Yousuf, welcome to our shared digital space. Thank you for your generosity in joining us today, and we look forward to your talk and our discussion. I will turn it over to you now, just again with a polite reminder to people that if they have questions, please do type those into the Q&A. Yousuf, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Amber, for that warm welcome. And thanks to you and to Sneha for organizing the talk and for inviting me Really looking forward to the conversation, and thanks also to Adam for joining us and commenting. So my talk today bridges my first and second research projects. It's primarily synthetic and theoretical, but it still arises out of my experience conducting research in Durban, South Africa, as well as from my own concrete experience participating in movements in the United States. From 2011 to 2015, I conducted research on the social movement Abahlali Base Mjondolo, Zulu for the people who reside in shacks, or the shack dwellers. I should know, however, that the subtitle of today's talk, Thinking from Durban, is not an attempt to think about Durban, South Africa, so much as it is an effort to take part of what I learned while conducting research in Durban and apply it more broadly to movements in other parts of the world. What I will offer is quite preliminary, so I hope to get some useful feedback from all of you. I'm presenting more of a potential research program rather than the findings of research, so your advice will be useful in terms of letting me know where you think I should go with it, how to operationalize it, or what potential pitfalls I should avoid. Lots of work has been done examining what the commonalities in our current crisis look like from above, most obviously through the lens of the decline of liberal centrism's hegemony and the rise of electoral alternatives oriented around right-wing authoritarian populism. Less attention has been paid to the resonances between radical movements that in the 1990s and early 2000s were commonly referred to as alter globalization struggles, and which have similarly experienced a profound awakening over the past decade. We sometimes lose sight of this, especially since the 2011 uprisings were soon eclipsed by the retrenchment of revanchist authoritarians, first in North Africa and the Middle East. This dramatic bifurcation, where polarized alternatives to liberal centrism appear to be gaining ground simultaneously, is most emblematic perhaps in places like Bolivia, where in the space of the past year, the movement towards socialism had its president removed from office by the combined forces of popular protest and the military. Evo Morales was replaced by Bolivian Christian evangelicals bearing the cross, only to have the indigenous-supported MAS come back again and win the presidential election late last year. Now, I want to avoid seeming too arrogant in my attempt to link otherwise disparate geographies. I don't want to appear inattentive to the particularities of place, but I do believe that we can nonetheless uncover certain resonances across time and place that might be productive in thinking through our current conjuncture. Here I'm thinking particularly with Sandro Mezadra's notion of resonances of the common, whereby a renewed practical and theoretical interest in internationalism takes into account the metaphorical project of translating politics across specific contexts, while keeping in mind the epistemic borders that continue to shape such initiatives. In this regard, the simultaneity of 2011 or of the 2020 uprisings is emblematic. In the former case, a chance event of self-immolation in Tunisia became the spark that ignited a global uprising. In the latter case of 2020, the murder of George Floyd kicked off yet another round of the diffusion of the global movement for Black lives, most recently to Nigeria, offering an example of the profound resonance felt between struggles across what are otherwise extremely heterogeneous contexts. As Mezadra notes, part of the background to any project seeking to identify resonances of the common today must include the fact that, quote, the scenario of a capitalist world system without a Western center is a concrete possibility for the 21st century. It would be quite a rupture within a 5 centuries long history, and there's a need to take stock of its meaning, both in terms of its potentialities and in terms of its risks. With this in mind, my attention today is to some of the possible resonances rather than to the particularities of some of these struggles. 2 concepts that have been useful for me in this regard are anti-Blackness and dual power. I'll begin with anti-Blackness. If racism should be understood according to Ruth Wilson-Gilmore, as group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, then anti-Blackness builds on this powerful framework. It draws our attention to the specific form of vulnerability to premature death experienced by Black people. Anti-Blackness demands particular attention alongside, but also at times departing from, the more general category of racism, in large part because of the specific social relations developed under racial slavery, primarily in the Americas. As Franco Barchiesi has recently argued, in South Africa, anti-Blackness has also been shaped by a distinction between good natives and bad Blacks, whereby good natives appear adaptable to the prevailing value system of Black-white alliance on the basis of embracing non-racialism and a willingness to engage in waged labor. Bad Blacks, on the other hand, comprise anyone unwilling to adapt to either of these principles: non-racial alliance with whites under the banner of a rainbow coalition, or disciplined hard work ethic for a capitalist boss. Historically, while the good native proved amenable to the civilized urban lifestyle of white-dominated cities, Blackness was geographically imagined to be relegated to a backward countryside, places that eventually became spatially confined Bantustans. In today's South Africa, where the afterlife of apartheid is still evident across the country, Blackness increasingly escapes the confines of rural life and is perhaps best embodied in the rural to urban migrant, especially in the figure of the shack dweller, who is seen as contaminating urban life, having invaded the forbidden quarters of the white city, setting up shop in the interstices of urban space. Frans Fanon spoke of these two dangerous and paradigmatically Black figures through the language of the rural peasantry and the urbanized lumpen proletariat. The important point for our purposes is that anti-Blackness usually has both a sociality and a spatiality to it. In a recent interview with Ananya Roy in the journal Urban Geography, together with my co-authors Willie Wright and Adam Bledsoe, we chose to speak of anti-Blackness with the anti in parentheses as one attempt to grapple with the relationality and conceptual distinction between Blackness on the one hand and anti-Blackness on the other. We especially had in mind the challenge posed by Catherine McKittrick when she says, "How then do we think and write and share as decolonial scholars and foster a commitment to acknowledging violence and undoing its persistent frame, rather than simply analytically reprising violence?" In following her proposed methodology for Black studies, McKittrick argues we will be better equipped to highlight the ways in which Blackness works against the violence that defines it. Or, as Lewis Gordon, an important theorist for anti-Blackness, has put it recently, an anti-Black world is not identical with the world is anti-Black. My argument, he proceeds to explain, is that such a world is an anti-Black racist project. It's not the historical achievement. Its limitations emerge from a basic fact. Black people and other opponents of such a project fought and continue to fight against it. Fred Moten is concerned with a similar slippage between anti-Blackness and Blackness, or between the structure of domination directed at Blackness and the inability of that structure to ever be totalizing. This opens up a conceptual space to think Blackness both in relationship to its hegemonic framing as a pathology, as pure objecthood, as a thing rather than a living human, and in relation to the social life made possible when this condition of objecthood or pathology is conceived as a doorway to new conceptions of self and community that bypass the notion of self-determination. Self-determination is often pointed to by most modern Western traditions of thought as the necessary prerequisite for subjecthood. Grappling with a certain utility in what it means to be turned into an object is, I think, at the center of Moten's study of Blackness. And I believe it's what he means by the case of Blackness. Moten uses the word case as a mediating term between the two different translations of Fanon's most famous chapter on the Black condition in his book, Black Skin, White Masks. Chapter 5 of Black Skin was originally translated into English as The Fact of Blackness, but was recently retranslated as The Lived Experience of the Black, in an attempt to capture the phenomenological basis of Fanon's work and his specific attention to what it is like to experience Blackness in a white world. Moten finds these two competing translations productive for thinking about the difference between Blackness and the Black. As he puts it, I want to linger in, rather than quickly jump over, the gap between fact and lived experience in order to consider the word case as a kind of broken bridge or cut suspension between the two. I'm interested, he continues, in how the troubled illicit commerce between fact and lived experience is bound up with that between Blackness and the Black. His interest is also bound up with an engagement with Afro-pessimism, a term that has its origins in racist white discourses concerning Africa's post-colonial predicament, but which has been taken up affirmatively by thinkers like Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton as a way of arguing for the need to dwell on the conditions of social death that continue to define the afterlife of slavery. Moten happily concedes that, quote, in the past decade, the most exciting and generative advance in Black critical theory, which is to say critical theory, is the announcement and enactment of Afro-pessimism. But in the face of a discourse that would seem to affirm Fanon's statement that the Black has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white, Moten wants to ask, is there ever anything called Black social life? And if there is, he probes further, what's at stake in the fugitive movement in and out of the frame, bar, or of whatever externally imposed social logic? A movement of escape, the stealth of the stolen, that can be said, since it inheres in every closed circle, to break every enclosure. This fugitive movement is stolen life. It is in this context that he finds utility to the notion of Blackness as a problem, as a case, as a pathology. Quote, studying the case of Blackness is inseparable from the case Blackness makes for itself, in spite and by way of every interdiction. In any case, it will have been as if one has come down with a case of Blackness. And he continues, this is to say that what is claimed in the name of Blackness is an undercommon disorder that has always been there, that is retrospectively and retroactively located there, that is embraced by the ones who stay there while living somewhere else. Some folks relish being a problem. I understand the approach to anti-Blackness that Moten is outlining to require a centering of a countervailing metaphysical system that emerged from what Cedric Robinson has called the whole experience of Black people, and not merely from the social formations of capitalist slavery or the relations of production of colonialism. Robinson terms this system the Black radical tradition. And I would argue that it offers us an understanding of forms of radical politics that operate from a position of relative autonomy vis-a-vis Marxism, even as it remains in fraught and productive debate with Marxism. It's from this lens that I believe we can best comprehend both the violent structures that shack dwellers confront, as well as the alternative visions of what they call a living communism that they seek to realize through collective struggle. Theorists of Black radicalism have consistently emphasized the extent to which this tradition has been an open-ended one, both in terms of its political ideology and in terms of its constituency. In How Race Takes Place, George Lipsitz is keen to point out the differences between a white spatial imaginary and a Black spatial imaginary in the United States. As he argues, the necessity of turning segregation into congregation has produced a distinct Black spatial imaginary that counters hostile privatism and defensive localism with democratic and inclusive ideals. Moten's own theorization of Blackness operates on a similar terrain, whereby Black people have a privileged but non-proprietary relationship to Blackness. In his formulation, and in that of Jared Sexton and Saidiya Hartman, I believe, Blackness is posed as a relation of non-sovereignty, or a condition of being without a home. Thought differently, if Africa is the figurative home of Black people, Blackness is the condition resulting from racial slavery of being homeless in the diaspora and simultaneously being unable to return to an original home on the continent. This condition of statelessness opens the door to a freedom drive that is not bound up with imagining statehood as the solution to one's problems. It bears repeating that for Moten, this stateless condition of Blackness is not reducible to Black people, even if Black people have a privileged relation to it. There's something similar going on here to what South African Black consciousness activist and theorist Steve Biko meant when he said, being Black is not a matter of pigmentation. Being Black is a reflection of a mental attitude. In so doing, he turned Blackness into an affirmative political category that required embracing a Black consciousness and simultaneously opened the category to other people of color as part of a political project that needed to be actualized rather than taken for granted. And yet today in South Africa, we are reminded of the limits of this project, given that there no longer exists a united front between all people of color fighting to overthrow white rule. Instead, as Wilderson and Sexton consistently warn us, white supremacy's junior partners, in this case, the Indian and colored communities in South Africa, now tend to unite with whites to vote for the even more neoliberal opposition Democratic Alliance Party out of a common fear of a Black planet embodied in ANC rule. It's been thanks to the failure of this ANC rule to live up to its promise of delivering a Black planet that new social movements have emerged over the past 2 decades in South Africa to challenge the state from the left. From the Treatment Action Campaign's successful struggle for antiretroviral treatments for people living with HIV/AIDS, to the struggle of miners who continue to fight for living wages and safer working conditions, the country has experienced a dramatically high level of social unrest in the form of mass protests. And although Marxism has had a profound effect on the country's rich tradition of struggle, it has most often been the wrong lessons from Marxist-Leninism that the country's self-proclaimed radicals have adopted. Both the ANC and the South African Communist Party continue to suffer from a vanguardist ideology that brings workers into the political fold as followers of enlightened middle-class leadership. This too often means that the majority of the country's people are seen as impediments to political struggle because of their insufficient proletarianization. Official unemployment continuously hovers around 25%, meaning almost double that number are out of formal work and practice, or as lacking in the necessary bourgeois skills to lead the struggle. in their struggle centered less around the workplace than around the needs associated with social reproduction, sanitation, childcare, electricity, and housing, the shack dwellers and other movements like them have brought my attention to a more neglected aspect of the Leninist tradition. Dual power is a term Lenin used to describe the situation in 1917 between the February Revolution that overthrew the imperial government and the October Revolution in which the Bolsheviks seized power. In this interregnum, two competing sources of power emerged. The first was traditional, in the form of the provisional government that occupied the vacuum left by the abdication of the Tsar. The second was a counterpower that existed alongside the provisional government in the form of workers' and soldiers' councils, the Soviets. Lenin says these are not just distinct powers in terms of their geographical location or in terms of their social composition, with the provisional government representing the bourgeoisie and the Soviets representing workers and peasants. He goes further than that and insists it is an entirely different kind of power, qualitatively, and draws parallels between the Soviets and the Paris Commune, where, quote, the source of power is not a law previously discussed and enacted by Parliament, but the direct initiative of the people from below in their local areas. And in the vein of contemporary abolitionist politics, he continues, the replacement of the police and the army, which are institutions divorced from the people and set against the people, by the direct arming of the whole people. Order in the state under such power is maintained by the armed workers and peasants themselves, by the armed people themselves. And finally, it is the more immediately democratic character of this power that continues to differentiate it from representative government for Lenin. Quote, officialdom, the bureaucracy, are either similarly replaced by the direct rule of the people themselves, or at least placed under special control. They not only become elected officials, but are also subject to recall at the people's demand. They are reduced to the position of simple agents, from a privileged group holding jobs, remunerated on a high bourgeois scale. They become workers of a special arm of the service, whose remuneration does not exceed the ordinary pay of a competent worker. While Lenin would arguably go on to betray this form of power, his insights remain. They offer a potential point of rapprochement between socialist and anarchist tendencies within radical movements today. As a strategy, dual power can be applied, and indeed has been taken up by, a variety of struggles, from the Zapatista movement in southern Mexico to Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi, and most recently by the feminist strike throughout Latin America. Since 2015, hundreds of thousands of women have taken to the streets in Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and elsewhere in a series of protests, general strikes, street parties, and community assemblies to denounce the violence faced by women and feminized bodies and to call for legalizing abortion. Veronica Gago, an Argentine militant in the feminist movement, understands the form of power mobilized in the feminist assemblies as a form of dual power, or what she calls feminist potencia, signaling that in the Spanish, there are indeed two words for power, poder and potencia. As she puts it in this relatively long quote, the concept of feminist potencia reflects this sort of movement by gesturing toward an alternative theory of power. To embrace feminist potencia is to vindicate the indeterminacy of what one can do, of what we can do. To acknowledge that we do not know what we're capable of until we experience the displacement of the limits that we've been made to believe and obey. It's not a naive theory of power, she argues, because it does not ignore the forms of exploitation and domination that structure power. In fact, its proposals go to the heart of the subjectivities that confront existing powers. In this sense, it is an understanding of potencia as the deployment of a counterpower. Ultimately, it is the affirmation of another type of power, that of common invention against expropriation, collective enjoyment against privatization, and the expansion of what we desire as possible in the here and now. Her understanding of feminist potentia, or what I'm calling dual power, is not a purely theoretical intervention. Rather, it is based on the concrete practices embedded in the feminist movement, the gathering of bodies in the street, the hijacking, twisting, and expanding of the notion of strike by the movement onto new terrains, and perhaps most importantly, in the democratic decision-making bodies without which the movement could not exist, what Gago calls assemblies, or the kitchen where the strike was cooked up. Her emphasis upon assemblies parallels something I learned from my time with Abahlali in Durban. Early on in the movement's existence, the phrase "no land, no house, no vote" was ubiquitous. It signaled the organization's unwillingness to participate in the electoral process as long as the institutionalized liberation struggle embodied in the hegemonic ANC had failed to realize concrete struggle objectives of land reform and the provision of housing for the poor. Whether it was because the state had abandoned them or they had abandoned the state, Abahlali insisted upon a parallel process of governing, grounded in autonomous communities that developed their own decision-making power in the form of assemblies. The language of the movement eventually shifted from a negative refusal, no vote, towards a positive identification of what filled the vacuum of the ANC's power: dignity. Dignity became their own word for what the community assemblies produced. It demanded that the poor develop their own voice as grassroots urban planners and that they insist upon their autonomous capacity as thinking beings. But whereas in Latin America, the notion of counterpower tends to operate as a replacement for constituted state power, with Abahlali I learned that this was not exactly the case. They seemed to recognize that dual power meant two simultaneously existing forms of power in fraught relation with each other. This was an often violent and tense relation, to be sure, but a relation nonetheless. There was no getting rid of the ANC or the South African state. Abahlali then seemed to be developing a more dialectical theory of dual power that I found reflected the actual messiness between movements and states in other parts of the world, but which their theoretical representatives often sidestepped. Abahlali's recognition of an antagonistic relationship to the state that nonetheless remains in dialectical tension and debate with the state takes a cue instead from UNAM and Latin American social movement scholar Raul Ornelas' statement that history will not be kind to rigid certainties. Despite the fact that much of the theoretical debate about movements, which Ornelas frames along the lines of counter-hegemony or emancipation, has fallen along relatively polarized lines, in reality, movements tend to adopt hybrid forms of struggle. While emancipatory struggles like that of Abahlali tend to emphasize their own autonomy as a project based on dignity, the movement has been forced to keep the lines of communication with the state open for survival purposes. Ornelas summarizes this common experience within emancipatory movements as follows. The idea of emancipation seeks the construction of horizontal and transparent ties based in affinity, and thus relations with political institutional actors become quite complicated. Despite this, and on numerous occasions, the need to survive or the possibility to achieve some crucial advance leads people to enter into alliances that break with the general logic of affinity. The primary difficulty stems from the fact that these alliances of affinity can result in the isolation and in the extreme annihilation of emancipatory projects. Above all, in conjunctures where institutional politics offers certain opportunities for change, or at least the chance to recuperate strength. I want to close, therefore, with a series of open-ended questions that I hope to pursue in this next project. When it comes to the movements we have witnessed over the past decades, what has been the nature of the relationship between the dual powers, between constituent counterpower and constituted power? What production of space and territorial practices might be associated with counterpower? And how do the concrete experiences of struggle by any number of movements speak back to the theorizations of anti-Blackness that underscore non-sovereignty, statelessness, and the seemingly spontaneous generativity of the freedom drive that lies at the heart of the Black radical tradition? Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Yousuf, for just such a kind of theoretically dense exploration of this tapestry of intellectual, kind of the genealogy of Black theory. I really enjoyed it, and normally we would give you a great round of applause at this point. I don't want to monopolize the time before I turn it over to Adam, but yeah, I was just thinking perhaps a couple of questions that I might raise immediately. So I did invite some of my undergraduate students to attend this talk. And I am wondering if you have time in the Q&A to talk about some of those concrete experiences of struggle that you referred to. The second point that I wanted to raise was that in this genealogy of Black theory, it does, it is quite focused on diaspora thinkers. And I wanted to kind of query that decision in your work. And you nodded to Steve Biko, and in so doing, I was thinking, well, what about Pan-Africanism? Where do you see Pan-Africanism within your work around social movements on the continent? So those are some initial provocations from just what was a great talk, and I'm left thinking through it. So I want to now introduce our discussant. Dr. Adam Elliott-Cooper is a research associate at the Center for Applied Sociology at the University of Greenwich. He received his PhD from the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford in 2016. His research focuses on policing and anti-racism, both in Britain and its colonies. He's the author of an excellent recent article published in the journal Antipod, the title of which is "The Struggle That Cannot Be Named: Violence, Space, and the Rearticulation of Anti-Racism in Post-Duggan Britain." He also has an excellent shorter piece in the journal Area that looks at student movements to decolonize higher education in South Africa, an article which my students have always enjoyed when I've taught it in the classroom. Dr. Elliott-Cooper's monograph, Black Resistance to British Policing, will be published by Manchester University Press. I understand it later this year. This is another book which I am eagerly awaiting. Adam, I will turn it over to you to open up the discussion based on Yousuf's excellent presentation.
Thanks so much, Amber, and thanks so much, Yousuf, for your presentation as well. I really enjoyed the way in which you developed really, I think, interesting and important connections between movements in the global south, mentioning things like Morales and the movements in parts of Latin America, talking about the global movement for Black lives, particularly in the global north, but also in other parts of the world as well, and linking that to your specific case study in South Africa. And I think making those connections is a really fundamentally powerful form of scholarship, which I really admired, and I really thought really enriched your paper a great deal. I also really like the way in which you worked through some of the messiness engaged in struggle, some of the slippery nature, right? This idea of being anti-states, but there being a necessity in utilizing lines of connection with state institutions and state agents and government for reasons relating to survival, but also potentially, I guess, as we've seen with groups like Abakalali, group reasons that are in some ways pragmatic, potentially, maybe something in history that maybe we can come back to. And I thought also the ways in which you thought through a number of different thinkers who are in some ways contesting with each other, and in some ways overlapping with each other, engaging in critical Black thought, in radical Black thought, in trying to come to a better understanding of not only the struggles that groups like Abakalali are engaged in Southern Africa, but I think the broader patterns of racism and racial capitalism from which they're confronting. I guess there may be 2 or 3 questions that I'd like to pose to you, which I guess are interconnected. And the first, I guess, is the fact that I think conceptually there's clearly a really interesting tension between the different theorists that you're drawing upon. And I think one of those clear tensions is the question of Afro-pessimism. So on the one hand, you have I think there are maybe potentially 3 camps. There are people who identify with Afro-pessimism and the kind of thinking that comes with that. So ideas around the world being anti-Black, and even people who are not racialized as Black, but also not racialized as white, being in some way invested in anti-Blackness. But of course, you also have people part of a Black radical tradition, which we might associate with Black Marxism or post-colonial thinking, which to one extent or another critique indirectly or sometimes directly Afro-pessimism. And I guess you have a kind of a third camp, which are people like Fanon, who are contested terrain to one extent or another, claimed by Black Marxism and Black Marxists who seek to critique Afro-pessimism, but also claimed by Afro-pessimists, right? Particularly the literature that you drew upon from Black Skin, White Masks, which attempts to think through the lived experience of Black people as well. And so I guess building on that, I guess one of my questions was about South Africa specifically, which is about the idea that Afro-pessimism can be used to critique the role of non-Black people of colour in South Africa, and potentially their support for political parties like the Democratic Alliance. And I was wondering how that fits with the fact that on the one hand, groups like Abakalali have also aligned themselves with the Democratic Alliance for strategic reasons in one way or another, but also, of course, the fact that the ANC are the democratically elected government of South Africa and are facilitating effectively forms of white supremacy, right? Enabling white's monopoly capital to maintain economic power over South Africa and facilitating the interests of Western capitalism effectively across Southern Africa, and the way in which maybe the thinking and the theorizing of people like Fanon and Biko and Cedric Robinson and their analysis of class and imperialism may also help us to think through the problems that Abakalali, Basonjondolo are currently facing in South Africa that might require us thinking beyond or even against Afro-pessimism. I think the second thing that I'm interested in is this idea of sovereignty, which I guess is something that's quite important to Afro-pessimism. So the idea of non-sovereignty and anti-Blackness, and about maybe the extent to which the fact that on paper, Black people have sovereignty over the land of South Africa, right? They have power over governance. But people like Adom Getachew and her engagement with the thought of people like Kwame Nkrumah and Joseph Nyerere and Eric Williams, and them thinking through the facts that there is a racialized global order, which means that sovereignty isn't enough in a world system which is determined by a racialized hierarchy, might also enable us to think beyond or even against Afro-pessimism in ways that are particularly useful by thinking through the politics of imperialism and racial capitalism and class, and in ways that are potentially useful as well. And I'll leave it there for now. I don't know if we're taking questions from the audience next, or whether, Yousuf, you want to say something.
Yeah,
to Amber and myself, or
how would you prefer, Amber? Should I answer these very useful applications?
So why don't you take Amber's and Adam's questions, perhaps, Yousuf, if that's okay with you. And then once you've answered those,
Yeah.
then we can jump to the audience.
Yes, sure. Well, thanks to both Amber and Adam for these fascinating comments and questions. I think they're very useful. So first, with regards to the question that Amber posed about some of the concrete experiences of struggle, speaking personally, I would go to kind of two spaces. First, just some, early inspiration that I received from the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, Mexico, as kind of, setting the stage for new forms of struggle in the global era, in the post-Cold War era, certainly in the 1990s and early 2000s, and the ways that they seem to be offering up a different way of thinking about struggle and revolution that was grounded in notions of autonomy, and I think very compatible with this understanding of dual power, right? They rose up, had an uprising that was ostensibly to seize the state, but really quickly what they said is that they realized the state also, as they thought it existed, no longer existed, and that the real sources of power perhaps lay even beyond the Mexican state. And so they kind of retreated into the jungles of Southeast Mexico and Chiapas and began to build up their own kind of communities and assemblies and good government councils that really operate as a different structure of rule outside of the state. So I think that was a particularly inspiring, a concrete example that was inspiring for me and for many people involved in thinking about what political struggle looks like over the past 20 or 30 years. And then when it comes to South Africa, and I think Adam referenced this as well, some of the messiness of movements was part of what led me to kind of rethink what I thought was potentially a romantic understanding of dual power and autonomy that I had inherited from my interest in Latin American movements and the Zapatistas. I referenced in passing the fact that Abasali finds themselves in kind of fraught tension with the state, with the local state. They insist upon their autonomy. And for them, that means first and foremost, insisting on their capacity to think as shack dwellers, to think and conceive of how the city should be planned and lived in. Not just taking orders from government or from local politicians or businesses, but nonetheless, they insist on maintaining an open line of communication with the state. And so it's as though they have not given up on the idea that the state might help alleviate some of their problems, certainly. And this came to a head in around 2015, 2016, when the movement was debating again democratically whether they should go back on their decision not to endorse any political party. And at that meeting, it won by a small majority. The decision was taken to endorse the Democratic Alliance. Now that was temporarily, it was in the lead up to just that one election. It wasn't an endorsement saying that we were going to join the Democratic Alliance. But this messiness, which soon fell apart, right? Because as I noted in my talk, the Democratic Alliance is even more neoliberal, even more of a kind of white majority anti-Black party than the ANC for sure. This messiness is kind of what led me to rethink, like, wait a second, there's something more complex going on here in terms of movements, relationships with the state. Now that alliance fell apart very quickly. It was an alliance that took place immediately after a number of Abasali members had been assassinated. Particularly, they believed, and this was proven in court by members of the ANC, who were really upset with them for critiquing forms of corruption within the local government. But obviously the DA could not provide any kind of, substantive alternative or even protection from the violence of the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal, which is what Abasali was hoping their endorsement of the DA might. They were under no illusions that the DA proved some kind of liberatory path. It was really a defensive position that they took. And since then, they've gone back and forth, refusing to endorse any electoral party, and then reforming a kind of alliance in the making with the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, which is an arm of the union movement oriented towards the state, one of the most radical unions, NUMSA, that's broken with the ANC and the South African Communist Party. So those are some of the concrete experiences that I would say kind of led me to these questions. Second, with regards to diasporic thinkers versus continental thinkers, I think this is a really important point, and I think I have to do more work in this regard. Certainly, as the talk noted, Biko is a really important reference point in my own thinking, certainly in the thinking of Abahlali and other movements in South Africa today. I think that obviously the diasporic continental divide within movements has been less prevalent historically. I think there's been a cross kind of pollination of ideas throughout history and a really important taking up of ideas from diaspora in the continent and vice versa, going back at least to the Garveyist movement in the early 20th century and the ways that those ideas circulated throughout South Africa. So I would be hesitant to pose any too strict of a divide or some kind of authentic notion of continental thought as needing to be drawn upon. But nonetheless, there's something really important there, as you're pointing out, about the importance of continental reference points. Other ones that I think would be important to look to in the South African context would be people like Robert Sobukwe and the Pan-Africanist Congress. You mentioned Pan-Africanism, and certainly that tradition of struggle, which was much more critical of the ANC already 60 years ago for what they saw as forming alliances with white radicals and white liberals already before Black consciousness. Sobukwe and the Pan-Africanist Congress was kind of saying, this is a dangerous terrain to walk on and one that might water down our politics. And that tradition certainly, I think, has been erased or at least marginalized by the ANC hegemony over struggle. Another reference point here would be certainly people like Mamdani, who's thought through a lot of these issues in the African continent as a whole, but specifically in regard to South Africa, thinking about settler colonialism in his most recent study. And I would say some of my work tries to both build on Mamdani, but also pushes back a little bit on his emphasis on the ongoing importance of ethnicity rather than race in Africa. So that would be how I would just answer that briefly, but I think certainly more work needs to be done. And part of that can be done by drawing upon your excellent work, drawing out the importance of people like Thomas Sankara for our thinking today, no doubt. Adam, I really appreciate the comments and the ways that you identified the kind of tension between these different currents of thought. I would say part of what I'm trying to do is to, yes, think through those tensions, absolutely, but to maybe do that in a way that doesn't reproduce the existing forms of polarization that I think a lot of us have seen in different currents within Black radical thought today. And certainly the tensions between Afro-pessimism on the one hand and Black radicalism on the other hand, at times have been quite fraught, extremely polarizing. You're either in one camp or the other. They can get quite dogmatic. And so part of what I'm trying to do is think beyond that, to see if we can learn from many different traditions and to not see them as so polarized. And that's why I think that although people like Fred Moten get put quite firmly in the camp of Black radicalism, you see that he is extremely laudatory of Afro-pessimism, even as he's trying to think against it in the name of social life, beyond social death, the possibility of social life. And so it's kind of in that spirit that I wanted to bring some of these thinkers together. And I think you are quite right that while I do think that the Afro-pessimist critique of junior partners and the kind of prevalence of anti-Blackness over and against other forms of racism and the ways that other people of color, communities of color can be complicit in anti-Blackness, I do think that critique applies really well to the South African context. And it's a really important one because it's policed. If you say something like that, you're seen to be bringing to life race and divisions and the dreams of the Rainbow Nation. And we also don't want to discount the very real lived traditions of struggle that all communities of color went through and continue to go through today. It's not as though Indian and colored communities are liberated, not at all in South Africa today. But I do think that that critique still applies to contemporary South Africa. But your emphasis upon class and imperialism and drawing out the critiques of class and imperialism from Fanon, from Robinson, from thinkers like Edom Getachew, I think is really crucial. In the United States, we're going through a kind of race class redux, right, all over again. Arguments about race reductionism versus class reductionism, arguments that we thought were confined to the past, but they've come to the surface again, potentially in a productive way. And I think South Africa is starting to see something similar, right? And it's been going through something similar. So really thinking through the intricacies of the relationship between race and class and drawing out the class centered critiques and critiques centered around imperialism, as you noted in the context of an ANC that is a Black-led party, absolutely, where they fit into the critique of anti-Blackness in the South African context is really important and a complicated question. And I can only say that it deserves much more attention, and I'll look forward to kind of thinking more about these things in conversation with the thinkers that you've mentioned, and I think are particularly useful. So maybe I'll leave it there and we can have some questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those insightful comments, in addition to your brilliant talk, Yousuf. So we actually have just one question so far from Hannah Brandkamp, who appears to have left, but hopefully he can catch the answer to the question in the recording. So Hannah says, great and fantastic, fascinating talk. I'm wondering how you think of conceptually dealing with the interregnum in many African societies lasting for 60 or so years since decolonization, rather than a mere couple of months, as in the case of the October Revolution.
As in the case of the what revolution? Was the last part?
The October Revolution.
Sorry, I still didn't get it.
Oh, the October Revolution.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes. Okay. Yeah, this is an interesting question, right? This notion of an interregnum as the time in between two states, potentially a transitional time. I would relate it to this question of transition, because in the African context, I think Hannah was absolutely right. There's been different periods in which, first the transition from colonialism to independence, and then in the 80s and 90s, the transition to democracy, which one would have thought that independence might have brought, but it did not. So it's been one series of really prolonged transitions, with each one kind of holding out hope for a more just potential future. And I do think that each of them have brought concrete benefits, no doubt about it. Independence is not to be treated lightly by any means, although we see the ways that it's also operated as a ruse. And the same thing is to be said about the democratic transition from above at the form of states, which has produced at best similar kind of two-party oligopolies that we have in the West. So this prolonged interregnum, I think, I'm not sure we can parallel them in terms of temporality exactly to the October Revolution, which was much more immediate. But I do think now that we've moved beyond this question of a transition to democracy, although we still see the struggle for that in places like Uganda today, we're clearly in need of something beyond that in terms of our political visions. And I think it's in that context that we can take recourse to some of these Pan-African thinkers that both Adam and Amber are emphasizing, people who thought beyond the state as a site of struggle, or beyond sovereignty as a fully realized form of freedom. Yeah, that's how I would probably answer that question, but I think I have to think more about that in terms of temporality. The last one would just be to say that South Africa was the last country, in a sense, to overthrow settler colonial rule. And so for them, it's a very recent fact, right? For the last 25 years, they've been existing under a kind of liberal democracy. And despite that, there's been tons of generative energy from below as a part of this broader global movement of ultra-globalization struggle. So part of what I'm trying to do is kind of yes, bring back Africa, but bring back Africa back into the world in the form of the conversations that movements on the ground actually see themselves as being a part of.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I'm conscious that we're a few minutes over time, but we do have one more question. Are you happy to take that question, Yousuf, or do you have...
Sorry, it's breaking up just a bit.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Do you have a few extra minutes, and would you like to take the final question we have? I'm conscious we're
Yes.
a few minutes over time, but if that's okay with you, yeah. Excellent.
Yes, that's totally fine.
So Izzy Pennington says, thank you for your great and in-depth talk. If resistances against anti-Blackness struggles are undermined through the utilization of state apparatus or alliances with democratic parties who still operate with capitalist frameworks, what hope is there when movements which are inherently anti-state, protests and riots, are also racialized? By this, I'm thinking contrasting language surrounding pro-Trump capital raids and BLM.
Okay, thank you, Izzy, for that question. Yeah, I think, I would add, if I think I understand your question correctly, I would add that the Ruth Wilson-Gilmore definition of racism that I referenced earlier, group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, she prefaces it by saying that this can be either state sanctioned or extra state, extra legal. So race in a sense can be both produced and sanctioned by the state, but it can also come from outside the state, and it can arise from other terrains as well. And so although, as you're pointing out, resistance against anti-Black struggles can be undermined through the utilization of the state apparatuses. Just taking recourse to autonomy doesn't necessarily solve that problem, right? And I think we're about to see that now as the United States transitions to a post-Trump era, and when we see these same white supremacist movements are not going away, right? There's no doubt they were emboldened by having someone like Trump in office, no doubt about it. But there's this dialectic between movement and state, including on the right, that I think also exists. And we will see the kind of white supremacist movement continue to attack movements like the movement for Black Lives, whether or not they actually occupy state power. So the second part of your question about the contrasting language surrounding pro-Trump capital raids and the BLM is, I think, really important in terms of what you're saying about how these movements are racialized. Although I want to pull away a little bit, and this is part of what the Black radical tradition has done, and part of what I think Moten is trying to do, is to distinguish a little bit the forms of racialization that are imposed on people in society through anti-Blackness, and the forms of potentially racial identity, or what we would call Blackness, from that anti-Blackness. That's part of what my talk was trying to do. Otherwise, we end up with a slippage where when we deploy an affirmative category like Blackness, we're accused for reproducing the very same categories that oppress us. And so part of what I'm trying to do in this talk is to draw upon people who were teasing those two apart, to show that on the one hand, we have a notion of Blackness that's actually open-ended, that's not essentialized, that's affirmative, it's related to the Black consciousness movement. And on the other hand, we do have a form of racialization that is profoundly anti-Black. And while these two things are related, they also can be pried apart, right? As Moten argues, Blackness kind of constantly escapes anti-Blackness. And so it's in that regard that I don't think we have to worry about the racialization of the movement for Black Lives if what we're referring to there is kind of the Blackness of the movement for Black Lives, right? So I think what you're pointing out is a really important tension. I would say that autonomy from the state doesn't necessarily solve this problem on the right or the left, and that, part of what I'm trying to do is to separate these two categories of anti-Blackness and Blackness so that we can begin to think the more generative conceptions of Blackness that I think are being produced within movements.
Thank you so much for that, Yousuf. I think that brings us to the end of this session. I want to say thank you again so much for having made the time for this talk, especially because I know it's quite early there in California for you. Amber and I are really delighted to have begun this webinar series with your fantastic talk. Thank you so much also to Adam for the really insightful comments on Yousuf's brilliant talk. So thank you so much also for having made the time for this. Thanks, everyone. We will see you 2 Fridays from now, where Wala Al-Kaisia will be speaking on queerness and decolonization. See you then. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.